Should I start? Good morning. How is everybody this morning? Can you all hear me okay? All right. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Alan Diello. I'm one of the 4 tutors, well, 1 convener and 3 tutors on the course. Some of you have me. And today I'm going to be giving a lecture on what I like to call the art of public relations, propaganda, political advertising, and spin. Now, I've kind of changed the title of the lecture somewhat because in my research to sort of create this lecture, I really discovered that this area that we're going to be dealing with in our topic is very much an art form. I like to think of it as this idea of weaving, whereas you can look at the idea of weavers of public relations, propaganda, and spin. They've kind of like woven their art, you might want to call it, like cloth over the entire spectrum of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Today, I'd like to show you some examples of this weaver's art, and through quotes, images, some videos, as it makes little sense to talk about these topics without showing the products, really. The lecture today is going to be divided up historically and topically because, interestingly, the key timelines for each section tend to move fairly gradually across the century. We'll begin by looking at the rise of public relations, the public relations industry in Britain, looking at its earliest history, immediately before and after World War I. The next section we'll look at is propaganda, which reached a very high level of refinement in the 1930s and 40s and into the early Cold War period. And then lastly, we'll discuss the rise of the concept of spin, which really parallels the introduction and spread of television right up to the modern permutations ascribed to Alistair Campbell for the former Labour government and now the former Tory press secretary, Andrew Coulson. Lastly, I'd like to leave you with some conclusions and food for thought. One point that I want to emphasize, though, is irrespective of any historical period that I might talk about through this lecture, none of these 3 topics are discrete. This continues across the whole spectrum of both the century, but it also continues today. They all continue in some form. They may be a lot more nuanced. For example, I'm going to show you a political ad from 1964, presidential election, which might seem a bit naive by our standards 50 years later almost. But I'm also going to show you a reimagining of that ad that I came across while I was doing some work for this lecture. And what I think is kind of interesting is that the same metaphors apply even today. Even they may be more sophisticated, but they still apply. However, no matter the differences, no matter the styles, PR, propaganda, and spin are very much still with us. It's the recognition of that and the recognition of its forms that's critical to the proper functioning of the public sphere and representational democracy that we rely on in Europe as well as in the rest of the world. Now, the public sphere, as I'm sure you know, as originally outlined by Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere by Jürgen Habermas, exists in the most basic terms as a space between the private individual and the government where discussions and consensus can be formed and influence government decisions and directions through public opinion. In a representational democracy like that we have in Great Britain as well as throughout most of the Western world, the implicit threat is that any politician that does not follow the will of the people will rapidly be out of a job. Now, Walter Lippmann, I'll send this out to everybody, so don't feel like you have to scribble quotes and things like that down. Besides, that way you can rewatch the videos and things like that that are built in. Walter Lippmann, in his seminal work, Public Opinion, which was published in 1922, states this idea very eloquently. In government offices which are sensitive to the vehemence and passion of mass sentiment, public men have no sure tenure. They're always, in effect, perpetual office seekers, always on trial for their political lives, always required to court their restless constituents. Now, many of the quotes that I'm going to use today come from Lippmann. Lippmann was a journalist who was interested in the tensions that arise in democracy due to issues around public opinion. Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, focused quite a lot on the idea that social cohesion is important in democracy, and that consensus is something that's desirable in the public sphere. Now, Lippmann has been criticized by other theorists, notably Noam Chomsky, because Lippmann implies that consensus and cohesion is so important that the public should be instructed or be managed in such a way that they will come to a preordained, obvious answer which fits into the political status quo. This idea of management leads us to the first area in the title, which is public relations. Most people think that public relations is a reasonably new term, or for those people who watch a series such as Mad Men, one that started in the post-war period in the 1950s. Public relations is a much, much older, and some would argue a much more sinister beginning at the turn of the 20th century. Though the ideas of public relations existed long before the 20th century, for example, government and society was always concerned with image and representation. For example, take a look at this, these satirical ads. These are from Punch magazine, and these are caricatures of Prime Minister Disraeli. However, it was really only in the 20th century that this idea of appearance and public relations began to take a more active process. For example, if you look at these pictures, they're not particularly flattering. They weren't meant to be. They were of a small society magazine. Well, it was actually a very large publication magazine, but it was targeted towards a small group of people. But in this, the Prime Minister is not looked upon very favorably. There's very little image control, and there's actually some not very veiled anti-Semitism in these pictures. Now, in trying to gain control of image and message, some of the earliest public relations firms arose out of the first Red Scare, or Communist Scare, during and immediately following the First World War. You need to have a bit of an understanding of the history of that time period to understand the importance of public relations. At the end of the First World War, Britain was very tired. It was, as history was to show later, an empire already beginning to decline, which World War II in some ways provided a coup de grace. However, in Europe, far more disturbing events were occurring. Russia at the time was engulfed in a terrible civil war, but the communists were for the most part on the rise within the country. In defeated Germany, Bavaria, Berlin, Hamburg had formed People's Soviets, which were eventually only overthrown with the help of far right-wing Freikorps, which were basically paramilitary groups and proto-fascist groupings, out of which the Nazis would emerge 4 years later. France had communists in their parliament, and back in Britain, the country was gripped by strikes due to long-standing war-deferred demands for higher wages, better working conditions, and, to quote Prime Minister Lloyd George, homes fit for heroes. Women were even being granted the vote. Now, in this time of terrible uncertainty, business and industrial magnates were scared. They saw their economic dominance, their social dominance, their control, and their fortunes being threatened by a public which would no longer stand idly by in deference to their betters as they did before the horrors of the First World War. To this end, meetings were held in Whitehall in 1919 among several members of the British Commonwealth Union and secretly the Prime Minister Lloyd George. And out of this, an educational organization was formed with the name of National Propaganda. The main point behind this was to create a system of what was then called, quote, peacetime propaganda to head off support for industrial disputes and create an environment where the voters, influenced by the newspapers, would consent to measures which would maintain the economic dominance and political dominance of the status quo. By 1922, national propaganda was able to boast that it could influence Parliament. MPs were literally on the payroll as consultants, that they could get articles in over 1,200 newspapers up and down the United Kingdom, and budget upwards of £100,000 a week for paid advertising and leafleting. Now, this was at a time when the average wage in Britain for a worker was about £1 a week, just to give you an example of the value of the money that was being spent. Now, the overall effect of these actions was fairly quick and positive for the people that were backing national propaganda. Support for the railways and coal strikes were blunted during the Great Strike of 1926. The initial support of the public gradually was weaned away with the help of what was then the nascent British Broadcasting Company, a private organization at that time, which was reorganized 2 years later into the modern British Broadcasting Corporation under semi-public control. Thus, this started the idea of organized bureaucracy and PR in the UK, but not on the most enlightened note. Miller and Dinan, in A Century of Spin, argue that the abject purpose of national propaganda was specifically to subvert democracy. Now, in the particular examples that I'm giving, I would tend to agree. However, public relations is not always aimed at such sinister ends. Public relations, you have to remember, is a system that allows for both corporate entities and government entities to represent themselves in the most positive and complementary light. For example, the oil industry is regularly utilizing public relations companies to try to improve their image as being ecologically friendly. And in this case, BP recently rebranded themselves, changing their logo to a green and yellow sunburst. Kind of looks sort of like a flower burst as well, emphasizing their use of biofuels and ecological integrity. However, the public sphere is not so easily fooled. As Lippmann is quoted as having said, "The private citizen, behest by partisan appeals for the loan of his public opinion, will soon see, perhaps, that these appeals are not a compliment to his intelligence, but an imposition on his good nature and an insult to his sense of evidence. I have violence on the mind." That was a big Freudian slip on my part. All right, so this gives you a basic idea of the groundwork of this idea of public relations as a managed field. This is very basic groundwork, and remember, across the span of the 20th century, from these beginnings, public relations developed into a multi-million-pound business with multiple firms. And we'll be looking at public relations again later in this lecture when we start looking at how they've directly influenced the political process in getting people elected. Rather than just using newspapers, they actually are stepping into the breach and working directly with the government. But on this historical timeline, to move forward a little bit, we're going to come into the era of propaganda. A good definition of propaganda is that propaganda is neutrally, and this is the important part, neutrally defined as a systemic force of purposeful persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of the specified target audiences for ideological, political, or commercial purposes through the controlled transmission of one-sided messages, which may or may not be factual, via mass and direct media channels. Now, you might ask, what's the difference between PR and propaganda? The main difference is semantic and it's nuanced. Especially since World War II, the term propaganda has become much more specific to government-sponsored dissemination of information that fits the terms of the quotation above. Oh, sorry, I went ahead. That fit this quotation, either explicitly or tacitly. Now, propaganda is used to motivate, to tap a basic instinct, such as the self-preservation or nationalism, to rally support for the government and its aims. Now, for example, these slides are very classic propaganda posters from World War II. and Britain, and they show the government using the imagery, in this case, of the crown and labor to emphasize that so long as we all work together, we will obtain victory in the war. It emphasizes this simple message with powerful images, the color red, for example, being bold, and demands attention with the white bold type in a clear and basic font. The hands holding the iron V are strong, and behind them is radiating power. Now, another point to realize is that, especially in the Keep Calm and Carry On poster, which has become quite a kitsch item lately, I don't know, it seems to be popping up everywhere. I've even seen it on tea cozies and things like that in all these different shops. But something to notice about this is the use of the crown and the use of the color red. Part of the reason why those two things are important is they're very similar to this idea of a symbol of publicity that Habermas talks about in his idea of publicity in the forms before the rise of the public sphere, where the state simply had to represent itself by symbols. So you have the crown there that's basically saying, by the authority of, and it's showing that that poster has a bit more gravitas to it, to say that this, you know, it implies almost that this is your monarch speaking to you, saying, keep calm and carry on. You can almost hear a Metropolitan BBC announcer in that very deep voice saying something like that. So that was very specifically done. Now, what I find interesting is that US propaganda posters at the same time were much more comic in a way. So in this case, these examples from the US, on one side there's a quote with using a fairly unflattering image of Hitler to provoke rage against what was then seen to be the supposed threat to the homeland. And on the other side, there was this idea of this little witty, let's catch him with his panzers down. And of course he's wearing swastika boxers, which I find particularly hilarious. But then again, in this more modern and enlightened age, you see virtually anything on boxers these days. So I don't know if those would be so funny now, to be honest. But the idea of these is to, in this case, imply that that Hitler is crazy. He looks crazy. He looks like a screaming lunatic, which is how he was very often represented in media, of course, outside of Germany. On the other hand, in this one, he's made to look like an absolute idiot. He's just made to look, you know, very foolish. So the idea, instead of, whereas in the British ones it was looking at power and gravitas, in this case, it's the US examples are sort of there to make you laugh, sort of there to make you question this person. You know, how can this person be a threat if they're literally caught with their pants down, or if they look so stupid? Do you see what I mean? Now, the next slides are very distasteful. I find these two images very distasteful. But this is another form of propaganda that I call fear of the other. And in this case, one is from the Allies and one is from Germany. This one is from the Allies. And the idea of that one is literally to impose this sense of fear that they're there watching you, that the Nazis are literally just behind the wall, peeking over. And it evokes the eyes of the other. Both of these I find very interesting because they use facial features to impart this idea of panic and fear. In the case of the Nazi one, it's the eyes and the field helmet. But in the other one, which I find much more distasteful because of how violently anti-Semitic it is, it's this idea of these really slitty yellow eyes and, you know, this giant, you know, nose from behind the curtain. And the direct translation of this is the Jews, warmongers responsible for extending the war. A direct translation into English is war lengthener, the wonderful German compound nouns. But basically, these examples that I've shown and others like them, this is what made, in some ways, particularly images like this one, are what makes propaganda a dirty word of late. In some ways, it's this very brash malign stepchild to public relations because it's blunt. But here's the interesting thing. Don't kid yourself that it's gone away. It's very much still with us. Because, for example, what is this? Is this soft news or is this propaganda? I would say it's a mixture of both. It's a bit of a public relations story, but it's also very much propaganda showing, you know, quote, the healthy British lad out in foreign parts, you know, doing his duty to crown his grandmother, no less, the crown and country, you know. And look, you too can have fun while you're out in the middle of Afghanistan. You too can play rugby and really have a great time. Or you can smile and shoot a gun. Isn't that great? Doesn't that make you want to go and sign up? That's what these images are trying to go for. I'm sure the fact, if you really wanted to analyze it, the fact that he's shirtless in this scene is to get, oh, you'd look so good, honey, if you just went out there and fought. Look at how good he looks. Again, it's more subtle than those posters, but it's pretty blunt. If you peel back that little bit of veneer, it gets to be very blunt very quickly. Now, I leave propaganda with another quote, and this one's from Lippmann, again. When distant and unfamiliar and complex things are communicated to the great masses of people, the truth suffers a considerable and often radical distortion. The complex is made over into the oversimple, and the hypothetical into the dogmatic, and the relative into an absolute. Now, we move into the more recent past with this discussion of political advertising and spin. Now, I'd like to show you an example of a classical political advertisement from the 1964 U.S. presidential election. This was a contest between Lyndon Baines Johnson, who won the election, and Barry Goldwater. Now, this ad, notably, was only aired once, and that was on September 7th, 1964. Just going to bring the lights down because the video's not that good.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I always find it interesting that people laugh at this now. I don't mean to say that it's not funny. It's 50 years ago. But the thing that a lot of people don't think about is the context that this ad ran in. The Cuban Missile Crisis was literally only approximately a year and a half before, in which the fear was that the world was going to go to thermonuclear war over missiles being placed in Cuba under the previous President Kennedy and Khrushchev. And it was literally called a situation where the two world superpowers, they described it as going eyeball to eyeball. Now, this ad would have had a lot more fear potential in it at that time. People would not have laughed at this ad. As a matter of fact, there was a massive, massive public outcry. Literally, there are folk stories or stories about, local stories about television stations' switchboards lighting up the instant the ad was played, with people screaming down the line of "How dare you!" Because it was considered just so scary. But again, it's about as blunt as those propaganda ads that we were looking at. Now, what's notable too about this ad is that it was one of the first uses by the U.S. Democratic Party of a public relations firm. It was created by the firm Doyle, Dane, Bernhardt in New York City. It literally caused such a controversy, though, that it wasn't aired again. However, it wasn't aired by the Democratic National Committee again. It was aired on the news, on talk shows, on discussion programs, on academic campuses, in conversations like this, in lectures like this. It got a massive amount of airing. It made the point. Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide, both on Kennedy's legacy and because ads like this literally portrayed Barry Goldwater, his Republican opposite, as being a warmonger. It also, Goldwater didn't do himself any favors. He had made comments previous to this, and one of the reasons also why this ad was taken so badly is he had made comments that he would consider using nuclear arms in Vietnam. Now, interestingly though, this spot has seen a recent reimagining, as has been happening quite a bit in the movies and things like that. And it's playing on a bit of a more modern context, looking at the new threat and panic around the budget deficit in the United States. Now, this was from last year from a congressional election in the state of Michigan.
6 trillion, 7 trillion, 8 trillion, 9 trillion.
3, 2, 1, 0. Years ago, we feared destruction from others. Now, our greatest threat is from within. The stakes are too high to elect another career politician or a former athlete. Vote Bill Cooper for Congress, constitutional conservative, job creator, and proven leader.
I'm Bill Cooper, and I approve this message.
What do you think of that? Does it, I noticed you all laughed, but do you think it gets the point across? No? Anybody? What do you think?
It doesn't tell you what a constitutional conservative is.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, which it doesn't really tell you much of anything, except it shows you, it appeals to this image again of this little girl picking flowers. Now, even the thing, too, that harps on is the fact that the generation that would remember that ad, the baby boomers are now seniors. Some are, you're getting into their mid-60s, they're starting to collect on Social Security. They're afraid of these things. That ad literally was scripted point for point, with the exception of a nuclear bomb blast going off. Instead, it was an explosion of debt. So, again, public relations and propaganda, there's a fine line between them. And I think when you look at things like this, they're not very subtle. And I think that fine line gets blurred very quickly. Now, I'd like to counterpoint this to the much more recognizable and far more subtle images from Saatchi and Saatchi.
6 trillion.
From Saatchi and Saatchi. These were considered to have helped Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives win the election, the general election of 1979. This is one of the most famous ads, "Labor isn't working." And it's a very simple message. It's a message that basically says, it's a message that basically says that if you elect labor, this is what you're going to get. This was the first one. This one here was run in newspaper commentary as newspaper advertisements. The bottom one was used as billboard advertisements, but both are the same theme. Now, sorry. Now, what I also want to show you, though, is how Saatchi and Saatchi did this. Now, there's an interesting clip that was done by a BBC4 show called The Rise and the Fall of the Ad Man, which looks at how public relations firms and the Tory government at that time literally became intertwined directly.
biggest symbolic coup for New Adland's reputation as a power in Britain came when the Conservative Party bought into it. Saatchi & Saatchi won the Tories' 1979 general election count. For the first time, a British advertising agency was central to a real power push, selling a would-be new government.
Had you asked me here to speak to you a year hence, I should have been able to tell you whether it does pay to advertise. For many people's sake, I hope it does.
Saatchi's self-promotion had paid off. The top Tories really believed advertising mattered, and that they were the best agency in Britain.
I think that Charles Saatchi had a reputation for the very best creative innovation and ideas. Maurice Saatchi was a brilliant salesman. They happened to be a formidable combination and built an incredible business.
It was Tim Bell, Saatchi & Saatchi's front man, who got the job of selling to Margaret Thatcher.
She loved it. It was one of those wonderful moments when you show somebody something and you know you don't need to do any sell because they've looked at it and it's absolutely what they wanted. One of the wonderful things about Mrs. T is that she absolutely believes in expertise. If she hires somebody as an expert, she doesn't double guess them, she doesn't ignore them, she lets them be the expert. And she's always said this to me, and it's still true. If you hire a plumber, you let the plumber do the plumbing. You don't tell the plumber how to do the plumbing or question what he's doing, you just get on with it. And so to some extent, if we said to her this is a great advertisement, she accepted it was.
In a word, Britain is going backwards. How have we got into this state?
What Charles and Maurice achieved was going to happen, just that they happened to be at the right moment with the right client.
Which means a dole queue that would stretch from London to Edinburgh.
I remember conversations with the Labour Party. The Labour Party just was not prepared to take that chance. The Labour Party, I got on very well with Harold Wilson. He was a lovely man. But Harold Wilson's idea that it was that advertising people were, well, not only were they below the salt, they were people you didn't really associate with. It was Thatcher and the people around her had the courage to not only bring them the other side of the salt, but actually embrace them.
Excuse me, is this the queue for 50p stalls?
Oh no, this is a queue for serious operations.
Is this a queue for the 50p stalls?
50p? Haven't you heard of inflation?
Tell you what I don't want to see.
What's that?
Labour in power again.
Labour in power? Was that the Marx Brothers?
No, another bunch of comedians.
Up to that point, political advertising was complete rubbish. And actually the work that Saatchi & Saatchi did wasn't that great. It was just a lot better than political people had done before. The difference is that the Tories took the chance on using a creative approach to certain things.
Do you remember what it was like at the beginning of '79?
This mixture of advertising and politics was new and controversial. The brothers, as ever, stayed low profile, but Adland's public mouth, Peter Marsh, was always there to comment.
But can I just say, you come from this puritanical school which says, I must decide what people have. They mustn't have their freedom of choice. Let us tell them what they must decide, not you. Actually, if they want to buy cat meat, they buy it.
The old Labour Party was fiercely critical, but just a few years and 2 election defeats later, the ad man had won over the sceptics. Leading director Hugh Hudson was hired to reposition Labour's Neil Kinnock as a dynamic, strong leader.
I think that the real privilege of being strong is the power that it gives you to help people who are not strong. I think the real privilege of being fit and bright and young, strong, is the ability that gives you to give others a helping hand when they're not strong, when they're old or disabled or poor or in need. And it isn't a sentimental attitude. I think it's a way of proving just what your strength amounts to.
It didn't work that time. They needed to change the product first.
And they did change the product. Now, an important thing also to note about this is that Thatcher embraced this idea of using PR firms to keep this message consistent during the elections. Unfortunately for the Labour Party, they didn't right away. And this, many people attribute to being part of why they remained, quote unquote, in the political wilderness for the next 17 years. Now, Labour ended up coming up with a new pitch for the 1997 general election, which really was playing into this mood of the country, which was tired of basically 17 years of the same conservative government. Now, in this case, the idea of New Labour, New Britain, this idea of bringing Britain forward, and the use of Tony Blair's image with the word new, which in this case was actually emphasized by it not being capitalized, as you can see in both cases. It becomes emphasized by the fact that it's not the bold words, it's not the capitalized word. Now, this idea has become quite a bit dated in the past 12 years, especially because we're now in a different political climate, we're in a different economic climate, a different social climate than that Tony Blair successfully was able to use to run to become the Prime Minister. Now, in the latest election that we just had in 2010, the tone changed very significantly. The tone is very cynical. It was very, very cynical, very dark, much more suited to this idea of what our politicians have been telling us, that we're going into this new era of austerity, this new era of tightening the belt, and we all have to come together in a big society, and etc. So, when you look at these ads, you can see that the Tories are really arguing that they will make sensible cuts while protecting the NHS, while Labour is talking literally about maintaining the working tax credit. That's what that one says. It's kind of hard to see. Let's see if I can bring it up a little bit bigger. Yeah, don't forget to vote Labour, Mum. So that way, you know, you'll maintain the working tax credit, whereas you have David Cameron here saying, we just can't go on like this. Now, of course, what they're not talking about is the truth again. The truth here is that the reason why the budget needs to be cut is that we had bailed the banks out the previous year. About a year and a half before this. We'd bailed the banks out, and the government had pumped billions of pounds into the economy to try to keep it afloat, going from a situation where the country was only reasonably in debt to actually having a potential for a deficit crisis. Now, on the other hand, we have ads like this. Don't let him take Britain back to the 80s. This is playing on the TV show Life on Mars. And the idea, not Life on Mars, its sequel, Ashes to Ashes, with the 1980s car, a symbol of pomposity. As a matter of fact, I think that that's just a really good Photoshop photo montage of the star of the series with David Cameron's head on it. And this, interestingly enough, started out as a guerrilla advertisement on the internet. And that's something that's kind of interesting that we'll talk about again as we go on through the term, is that PR firms aren't the only game in town now, because we have a more multifaceted media environment where there's more bidirectional communication. Rather than the simple traditional broadcast model from the top down, there's now a bit of information that can go from the bottom up. You have more examples of things like this, of guerrilla advertising. Now, the Tories' response to this was a very unflattering picture of a very unflattering, very unphotogenic, rather, I should say, politician with a very watered down point, it's sort of a soundbite idea of what really happened. Again, not talking about the truth, which is that Britain's jails were overcrowded, and under EU law, they needed to reduce the prison population or build new prisons, of which Labour was doing both. But no, I let 80,000 criminals out early. Vote for me. Now that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. Now, with the election behind us, and the new country supposedly behind the new LibCon, or as a lot of people, again, in this idea of guerrilla advertising, have been calling Condemnation Coalition being in power, at least we can see, though, that these ads do have some small basis in truth. David Cameron had, well, no, actually they don't, because David Cameron is cutting the NHS by stealth, by this NHS reform. So you see, the message is such that he can say that he is still, oh, I haven't cut the NHS, we're reforming it. So, however, these political advertisements really fit with Lippmann's idea of manufactured consensus. And they portray the party in a fashion which makes it accessible and interesting for the public and creates a theme of discussion which, again, to go back to Lippmann's idea, should hopefully lead you naturally to consensus. However, what does a party do once they are in office? And this is where the idea of spin becomes critically important. Spin is defined colloquially as a situation where a government will portray information that it's releasing in a most positive light that it can, while at the same time trying to de-emphasize and bury, which is another word for it, information that does not look well on themselves. And it also involves this selective releasing of information and timing very critically. It's a form of public relations management which ensures ironclad control over the public face of the organization. For example, in the article, A Good Day to Bury Bad News, the idea of press manipulation is directly discussed. In it, in the former government, the spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, mandated that all ministries and departments in the government had to negotiate directly with his press office with information to be released to make sure that all departments would be on message for that day. Now, he also had strong contacts with journalists, and he used to favor those who wrote favorably about the Labour Party and stayed on their message, and he would, quote, freeze out those who would not. Now, his press office was notorious for a memo that was leaked from September 11th, 2001, which recommended the release of any news that ministries wanted buried on the 12th due to the preponderance of 9/11 news coverage. However, spin is probably most notorious for this idea of the sexing up incident around the Iraq War dossier, where the government was accused of enhancing information in the dossier about weapons of mass destruction in order to better support its case for the war in Iraq. Now, out of that comes this quote that is attributed to Alistair Campbell. Come on, you don't seriously think we won't find anything? Basically implying that even if they didn't have direct evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction in the country, that of course we'll find something. In other words, it doesn't matter how much we change this dossier, this stuff will be there and we'll just make it look like it's what we thought was there. And this was later published in Did I Say That? The Observer, in an article in the Observer magazine, which literally was going through notable quotes that people made. That later, I guess you could say, came back to bite them in the behind. So this idea of press manipulation isn't new. Now, as I've discussed earlier on in the lecture, one of the goals of national propaganda was to directly manipulate the press by simply paying for journalists to write articles which would then be published. This modern idea of spin is a bit more nuanced, again, insofar as the government's not directly paying journalists in the domestic sphere to print favorable articles. Now, there's a lot of evidence that they do in the foreign sphere, though they don't talk about it. There's a lot of evidence that they pay for articles in foreign newspapers and foreign news sources. But again, this isn't discussed, and in some cases, if you accuse them of it, they say, well, that's an issue of state security. Now, however, in a more recent permutation of this idea, we have Andrew Coulson, and he was named David Cameron's press secretary while Cameron was still opposition leader. This can potentially be looked on as a further consolidation and continuation of this spin regime, since many commentators recognized at that time that Coulson's later appointment as government director of communications smacked of being the payoff for News International support in the 2010 election. However, rather than simply exerting control on access to the government, Coulson's position seems to have given the press unusual levels of access and the potential for direct influence with the government. It's come out in the phone hacking scandal that Andrew Coulson had allowed access of people such as Rupert Murdoch and Rebekah Brooks directly to Number 10. Now, I also find it important to note that Rebekah Brooks supposedly has been a very close friend of the Camerons for at least 15 years. But I find this interlocking of the press and the political establishments to be somewhat disturbing. Now, it's also come to light since the phone hacking scandal has broken that Coulson was still on the pay of News International while he was David Cameron's press secretary. Now, this I find to be very interesting as well because it's a reverse of the former ways of funding and pay moving from the government to the press. Now, the press is paying the government, in a way, you could argue. Now, these links between the press and the Conservative Party, and in this case particularly Number 10 Downing Street, have been cemented together. Now, with the breaking of this phone hacking scandal over this past summer, more and more questions have been asked about access and level of collusion that Coulson, Brooks, and by those proxies Rupert Murdoch, have with the Cameron government. This whole situation is a very new and problematic turn for the idea of spin, because it now means that there's an even greater potential for collusion and a compliant media, which further erodes the idea of a media watchdog and undermines the whole idea of the media's essential role of information transmittal for democratic participation within the public sphere. By the way, this picture is from his evidence that he was giving to a parliamentary inquiry over the phone hacking scandal. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to leave you with some thoughts for today. The concept of public relations, propaganda, political advertising, and spin have been with us for quite a long time. The Lippmann, as the sort of founding father of this area of interest, takes a fairly neutral approach in his work. It's clear that these four areas have a critical effect on the public sphere and our decision-making capabilities as citizens and voters. How can we reconcile the manipulation and modification of information by politicians with our PR firms and spin doctors with our democratic system? Now, this is going to be the crux of what we'll be talking about in our discussions this week to some extent. Now, I'd like to leave you with two final quotes from Lippmann. What we call a democratic society might be defined for certain purposes as one in which the majority is always prepared to put down a revolutionary minority, and when all men think alike, no one thinks very much. Thanks very much. How'd that go? Thank you. What I'll do is I'll send it to you guys, and then you can forward it on. It's just a link. Be right out of your way.